I wasn't looking for a missing year. I was looking for the date on an old map, a copper plate engraving of London, the kind they sold on street corners in the 17th century. I wanted to know when the city had looked that way. The cartouche in the corner read MDCLX, which is 1689, but then I noticed something odd about the map itself. The River Thames was drawn too wide, the streets too straight, the buildings too uniform, as if the city had been planned rather than grown. I checked another map from 1695, same geometry. Then I found one from 1705, and the city had changed completely. Wider boulevards, new squares, a different scale altogether. And between those two maps, there was almost nothing. No gradual transition, no decades of construction. Just a before and an after, with a gap where the messy, organic growth of a real city should have been. That gap, I came to realize, was the year 1700. Not the calendar year that exists on paper, but the lived, documented, photographable, building-by-building year 1700. And the more I looked, the more it seemed that for much of the world, that year never actually happened. The records are thin. The architecture is wrong. The dates don't line up. And what I found next made me wonder if someone, somewhere, deliberately erased an entire era from history. The official story, of course, is simple. The year 1700 was just another turn of the calendar, the last year of the 17th century in the old Julian system, or the first year of the 18th in the Gregorian, depending on which side of the Protestant-Catholic divide you stood. The world was in transition. The Baroque was giving way to the Rococo. Newton had published his Principia a decade earlier. The Enlightenment was stirring. Cities were rebuilding after fires and wars. London had burned in 1666 and was rising again. Paris was being remade by Louis XIV. St. Petersburg was founded in 1703, practically from scratch. The narrative is one of steady progress, of wooden cities becoming stone, of medieval winding streets being straightened into grand avenues. It all makes sense if you don't look too closely. But if you start looking at the actual buildings that supposedly date from exactly that period, the ones that are supposed to have been built between 1690 and 1710, you begin to notice something strange. They don't look like they belong to a transitional era. They look like they belong to a different world entirely. And the dates carved into their cornerstones, the dates recorded in municipal ledgers, the dates that appear on architectural plans, they start to feel like labels pasted onto something that was already old when the label was applied. The first crack appeared in a building I had walked past 100 times without thinking. St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The official story says it was built between 1675 and 1711, designed by Christopher Wren after the Great Fire. The cornerstone was laid in 1675. The final stone was set in 1711. That's a 36-year construction timeline, which for a cathedral of that size is not unreasonable. But here is the problem. The architectural style of St. Paul's is not English Baroque, as the textbooks claim. It is something else. The dome is a direct copy of St. Peter's in Rome, but with proportions that were not mathematically understood until the late 18th century. The portico is based on a Roman temple that had not yet been excavated when Wren supposedly drew it. The stonework is so precise, so uniform, that it would have required industrial-scale quarrying and transport that simply did not exist in the 1670s. The interior is covered in mosaics that were not technically possible with the materials of the time. And then there are the photographs, actual photographic plates from the 1850s, showing St. Paul's looking exactly as it does today, weathered, aged, settled. If it was finished in 1711, that would make it about 140 years old in those photographs. But the stone looks like it has been standing for 500 years. The patina is too deep. The joints are too tight. The entire building looks as if it was placed there, fully formed, from a civilization that had mastered materials we have since forgotten. Wren's own drawings for the cathedral are sparse, inconsistent, and radically different from the finished structure. He supposedly changed his mind repeatedly. Or, and this is the uncomfortable possibility, the drawings were made after the fact to explain a building that was already standing. Then there is the matter of the cities that appear out of nowhere. St. Petersburg is the most famous example. The official story says Peter the Great founded it in 1703, draining swamps and building a capital from nothing in a single generation. The Hermitage Museum, the Winter Palace, the Peter and Paul Fortress, all supposedly built between 1703 and 1725. But the scale of the stonework, the engineering of the canals, the foundation systems that kept the buildings from sinking into the marsh, these are not the achievements of a semi-Asiatic kingdom emerging from medieval isolation. They are the achievements of a civilization that had been building in stone for centuries, and yet, before 1703, there is almost no record of large-scale stone construction in the region. The Swedes had built a few forts. The Novgorodians had built wooden churches. Then suddenly, in less than 20 years, a fully planned neoclassical capital appears, complete with palaces that would have taken decades to build even with modern machinery. The official explanation is that Peter imported thousands of Italian and French architects and forced tens of thousands of serfs to work in shifts. But the architectural historian who looks at the proportions, the stone-cutting techniques, the use of granite monoliths that weigh hundreds of tons, they will tell you that something is off. The technology to move those stones, to lift them into place, to carve them with that precision, did not exist in 1703. It barely existed in 1803. And yet there they are. Consider, if you will, the star forts. These are the massive, geometrically perfect fortifications that dot Europe and the Americas, polygonal bastions with angled walls designed to deflect cannon fire. The official history says they were built between 1500 and 1800, evolving slowly from medieval castles. But the most perfect examples, the ones that look like they were drawn with a compass and ruler, are consistently dated to the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The fortress of Louisbourg in Nova Scotia, supposedly built in 1713. The citadel of Lille, supposedly finished in 1670. The fortress of Almeida in Portugal, dated to 1640. But these dates are carved into stones that show no sign of the incremental construction that real fortresses display. There are no sections built in different eras, no repairs, no modifications. They appear fully formed, as if the architect simply ordered a mountain of stone and assembled it according to a plan that had been perfected somewhere else, at some other time. And the geometry, the precise angles, the interlocking fields of fire, the underground tunnels that connect the bastions, this is not trial and error engineering. This is the application of a mature science that has no recorded origin. The earliest known treatise on star fort design is from the mid-16th century, but the drawings are crude, the calculations primitive. Then, 100 years later, fortresses appear that could only have been designed using trigonometry that was not formally published until the 18th century. The gap is too large, the leap is too sudden. And the year 1700 sits right in the middle of it, a kind of black hole in the timeline, where the technology of stone construction seems to have advanced by centuries in a single generation. But here is where it becomes difficult to explain. The buildings that date from exactly the year 1700 or thereabouts are not just large, they're perfect. Take the Zwinger Palace in Dresden. The official date is 1710 to 1728. It is a masterpiece of Baroque architecture, with pavilions, galleries, and a courtyard that seems to float. The stone carving is so intricate, so delicate, that it looks like lace. The statues that adorn the rooftops are so lifelike, so anatomically correct, that they could have been cast from living models. But the techniques used to carve that stone, the undercutting, the hollowing, the thin arches that seem to defy gravity, these were not developed in Europe until the 19th century. The sculptors of the early 18th century worked in marble, yes, but they did not work sandstone like this. Sandstone is brittle, it breaks. And yet the Zwinger's sandstone decorations have survived centuries of weather, war, and pollution, with almost no degradation. Either the stone was treated with a preservative that has since been lost, or it was carved by tools that left a surface so smooth that water cannot penetrate. Neither explanation fits the official story. And when you dig into the archives for the Zwinger, you find something strange. The architect Matthias Daniel Puppelmann left almost no drawings. He was a military engineer by training, not a palace architect. The plans that survive are vague, almost schematic. It is as if someone handed him a finished building and told him to sign his name to it. Then there is the mystery of the missing timber. Europe in 1700 was supposedly covered in forest, but the buildings that survive from that period use wood that is older, denser, and straighter grained than anything available in Europe today. The roof beams of the Zwinger, the floor joists of the Hermitage, the structural timbers of the fortress of Louisbourg, they are all cut from trees that were hundreds of years old when they were felled. But where did those trees come from? The forests of Europe had been heavily logged for centuries. By 1700, old-growth timber was scarce. And yet these buildings used planks that are 3 feet wide, 40 feet long, with no knots, no warping, no signs of having been pieced together. The only place you find timber like that today is in the Pacific Northwest, or in Siberia, or at the bottom of a lake where it has been preserved for centuries. The official explanation is that these beams were imported from the Baltic, but the shipping records are thin. The trade routes are poorly documented. And the sheer volume of timber required for a single building like the Winter Palace would have required thousands of shiploads. The records do not support it. The records, in fact, are suspiciously quiet about the entire period between 1690 and 1710. It is as if the paper trail has been thinned, edited, or simply never existed. And then there is the problem of the maps. If you spend any time in the archives of 18th century cartography, you begin to notice a pattern. The maps from before 1700 are crude, often inaccurate, with vast blank spaces labeled terra incognita and coastlines that wander. But around 1710, a new kind of map appears, suddenly, precisely, as if a veil had been lifted. These maps have correct latitudes, accurate coastlines, and interior details that would have required decades of surveying to produce. The famous Delisle maps, the Homan atlases, the Cassini survey of France, all begin in the first decade of the 18th century, and they are breathtaking in their accuracy. The Cassini map of France, started in 1750, is often held up as the first modern map. But if you look at the maps of the Russian Empire from 1715, produced by the Swedish prisoners of war under Peter the Great, you find the same precision. Rivers that actually flow in the correct direction, mountain ranges placed where they actually exist, cities located within miles of their true position. How did Swedish cartographers, working in a country they had never seen, with limited instruments and no aerial photography, produce maps that would not be improved upon for 100 years? The official story says they used astronomical observations and triangulation. But triangulation on that scale requires a network of measured baselines, hundreds of them, stretching across thousands of miles. There is no record of those measurements. No survey teams, no field notes. The maps simply appear as if someone had already drawn them and the cartographers were merely copying. Now consider the matter of the bells. Bells are one of the most difficult objects to cast in pre-industrial metallurgy. They require precise alloys, controlled cooling, and a casting pit that must be dug and prepared months in advance. The largest bells in the world are all dated to the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The Tsar bell in Moscow, supposedly cast in 1735, weighs nearly 200 tons. The Great Bell of Damazetti in Burma, lost in 1608, was even larger. But the Tsar bell is cracked, never rung, and sits on a pedestal as a monument. The casting pit is still there, and it is enormous. But the technology to pour 200 tons of molten bronze, to cool it evenly, to tune it to a specific pitch, that technology did not exist anywhere in the world in 1735. The largest bells cast in Europe before 1700 weighed perhaps 10 tons. The leap from 10 to 200 tons in a single generation is not an evolution. It is a miracle. And the Tsar bell is not alone. The Mingan bell in Myanmar, cast in 1810, weighs 90 tons. The Great Bell of Moscow, cast in 1655, weighed over 100. The dates are all over the place, but they cluster around the turn of the 18th century, as if some global bell casting knowledge had been distributed, used, and then lost. The Guild of Bell founders in Europe kept their techniques secret, but not that secret. The formulas for the alloys, the temperatures for the pour, the timing of the cooling, these are not things you can invent in a workshop. They are the product of centuries of trial and error, and yet the trial and error is missing. There are no records of failed casts, no experimental bells, no intermediate sizes. The bells simply appear, fully formed and perfectly tuned at the exact moment when everything else also appears. But here is the anomaly that I found most difficult to reconcile. The year 1700 is also the year that the great cathedrals of Latin America were supposedly completed. The Metropolitan Cathedral of Mexico City, begun in 1573, was supposedly finished in 1813, but its most ornate sections, the Altar of the Kings and the Chapel of the Angels, are dated to 1718 and 1724 respectively. These are not stone structures in the European style. They are covered in gold leaf, carved from a local stone called tazantal, and decorated with sculptures that combine European and indigenous motifs. The craftsmanship is so fine, so intricate, that modern restorers have been unable to replicate it. The gold leaf is applied in layers so thin that light passes through it. The stone carvings are undercut to depths that modern tooling cannot achieve without breaking the material. And the scale is enormous. The cathedral covers nearly 2 acres. The official explanation is that indigenous artisans, trained by Spanish monks, executed the work. But the indigenous peoples of Mexico had no tradition of stone vaulting, no knowledge of the flying buttress, no experience with the kind of structural engineering that holds up a 2-acre stone roof. They were master masons in their own right, but their tradition was based on the flat roof, the post and lintel, the pyramid. The cathedrals of Mexico are Gothic and Baroque in their engineering, and they appear fully formed in the first decades of the 18th century. The training period, the apprenticeship, the slow transfer of European knowledge to local hands, none of it is documented. The cathedrals are just there, complete, as if they had been built by a civilization that already knew how. And then there is the matter of the windows. The 18th century is the age of the window tax in Europe, but it is also the age of the impossible window. The Palace of Versailles, supposedly completed in 1682, has windows that are 12 feet tall and 4 feet wide, with panes of glass that are themselves enormous. The technology to produce flat glass of that size did not exist in 1682. The crown glass process, which produced small, slightly distorted panes, was the standard. The plate glass process, which allowed large, flat, undistorted panes, was not perfected until the 1840s. And yet Versailles, the Winter Palace, the Zwinger, and dozens of other buildings from the period have windows that appear to be made of plate glass. The panes are too large, too clear, too uniform. If you look at photographs of these buildings from the 19th century, before modern restoration, the windows are the same, enormous, flawless, letting in light that should have been impossible. The official explanation is that the panes were made by the cylinder method, which produced larger sheets, but still not that large. The cylinders themselves were limited by the strength of the glassblower's arms. To make a pane 12 feet tall, you would need a cylinder that was at least 6 feet in diameter and 12 feet long. No human can blow a cylinder that large. The glass would cool and crack before it was half formed, and yet the windows exist. The records of their manufacture are vague, often attributed to a single glassmaker who appears from nowhere, produces the impossible panes, and then disappears from history. It is the same pattern. The knowledge appears, is used, and then is lost, with no intermediate steps. Now step back and connect the dots. The buildings, the maps, the bells, the windows, the fortresses, the cathedrals, all of them appear in a window of roughly 50 years, centered on the year 1700. Before that window, the technology is primitive. After it, the technology is forgotten or suppressed. The official story says that this was the age of the Enlightenment, a time of rapid progress and discovery. But what if the progress was not progress at all? What if it was rediscovery? What if the year 1700 marks not the beginning of a new era, but the end of an old one? The alternative theory, the one that the mainstream historians dismiss, is that a global civilization existed before the year 1700, A civilization with advanced metallurgy, precision stoneworking, and a network of trade and knowledge that spanned the continents. And then something happened. A catastrophe, a flood, a war, a deliberate erasure. Something that brought that civilization to an end and left only its most durable structures standing. The survivors, the people we call the founders of the modern era, found these structures and claimed them as their own. They built new governments on top of the old foundations, rewrote history to fit their narrative, and destroyed or hid the evidence of what had come before. The year 1700 became the new beginning, a reset point, after which all records were redrawn. Who benefits from this forgetting? The ruling classes of Europe, the empires that emerged in the 18th century, the nation-states that needed a clean origin story. If the palaces of St. Petersburg were built by a lost civilization, then Peter the Great is not a genius. He is a squatter. If the cathedrals of Mexico were built by a pre-Columbian civilization with advanced engineering, then the Spanish conquest is not a triumph, it is a tragedy. The official history, the one we are taught in schools, is a story of progress, of Europe rising from the darkness of the Middle Ages to the light of the Enlightenment. But what if the light was always there, and the darkness was imposed? What if the year 1700 is not the dawn of a new age, but the moment when the old age was buried and forgotten? The erasure would have been carried out systematically. Archives were purged, libraries were burned, dates were recarved on monuments. The very concept of the Dark Ages was invented to create a gap between the classical world and the modern one, a gap that could be filled with a story of gradual improvement. But the evidence does not support that story. The evidence supports a sudden collapse, followed by a slow and incomplete recovery. The buildings we call 18th century are far too advanced for the technology that supposedly built them. The maps are too accurate. The knowledge is too complete. Something is wrong with the timeline, and the year 1700 is the hinge on which it turns. So who really built the Winter Palace? Who surveyed the coastlines of Russia and produced maps that are still accurate today? Who cast the bells that weigh 200 tons and tuned them to a pitch that we cannot reproduce? Why does the record begin exactly in the year 1700, with no trace of what came before? And what else was standing before the maps were redrawn, before the archives were burned, before the dates were chiseled into the stone to tell us a story that never happened? The buildings are still there. They are not lying. But the dates carved into their walls, those may be the biggest lie of all. The year 1700 never actually happened. It was invented. And if that is true, then everything we think we know about the past is built on a foundation that does not exist. The question is not whether the evidence is there. The question is whether we are willing to look.